Welcome to the Targeting Student Needs Using Formative Assessment presentation. My name is Cindy Hopkins and I will be your presenter. The purpose of this training is to introduce formative assessment and begin to explore strategies and practices that can be used daily within the classroom. This is the first in a series of training presentations surrounding data-driven instruction and formative practices. For today's presentation, we'll start with a review of different types of assessments, then the remainder of the presentation will be focused specifically on formative assessment. We will take a look at the benefits of using formative assessment and the formative assessment process. Next, we'll go over keys to effective formative assessment, and we have some video presentations showing it in practice. We will finish up by sharing references used to develop today's presentation and support you in learning about formative assessment. Finally, if you're not already using formative assessment in your schools and classrooms, we would like to invite you to incorporate these practices, whether it be those you see during our presentation today or others you are familiar with or learn about. We'll start with an overview of assessments. Assessment in its truest form is a process of evaluating the current state of something so that informed decisions can be made about how to move forward. We often use assessment in life, such as when we take a car to the mechanic for evaluation. The mechanic collects data about what is wrong with the car, then provides the evidence to the customer so that he or she can decide the best way to move forward. Assessment in education follows a similar process. Educators collect data about what a student knows and then use that data to make the best decisions for students. Assessment is crucial to move from opinions to informed action. Again, we are constantly using assessment evidence to help us make informed decisions. Since no single measure can provide us all that we need to make these decisions, we must be sure we have a balanced system with a variety of assessments that work together. Having a good understanding of what evidence is needed will guide you in determining an assessment that will provide that information. 3 questions we need to ask to decide what assessment to use are: who is going to use the information? How will they use it? What information and in what detail do they need it? Take a moment to look at the assessment spectrum. This spectrum demonstrates the wide variety of assessments that should be present in a classroom. Each type of assessment is important and can be used for different purposes. The spectrum shows examples of assessments that fall under the summative category and assessments that fall under the formative category. You can see that some of these assessments may fall into more than one category on the spectrum. Specifically, interim benchmark assessments are shown as falling under formative and summative assessments. We want to focus on the fact that how you use data from benchmark interim assessments determines the category of the assessment. Using benchmark interim assessments to inform and direct instruction means they would fall in the formative category. A balanced system of assessments means you would use a variety of the assessments that are shown on this spectrum. Summative assessments are used after instruction and learning has occurred. Examples include large-scale statewide tests, end-of-unit classroom tests, and final projects. Assessments used during instruction, like learning journals, observations, or small group discussions and rubrics, would be considered formative. Think of summative assessments as assessments of learning. They render a judgment after the conclusion of instruction and learning, and as shown in the spectrum visual we just reviewed, they can occur at the system or classroom level. Large-scale standardized summative assessments are designed to measure student achievement and support evaluative judgments on the overall impact and effectiveness of educational programs at the end of the course, the study, or the end of the school year. Benchmark interim assessments can be used summatively or formatively. Summatively, they measure students' achievement several times a year. They help students progress towards grade level standards, hold educational programs accountable, and signal areas for investigating curriculum scope, sequence, and planning professional development. Formatively, they provide baseline or pre-assessment data about where students are along the learning progression before instruction begins, and they can provide data that informs lesson plans and decisions about how to place students in small groups. It is important to note that Indiana's use of the Formative Assessment Grant has primarily focused on the formative use of benchmark interim assessments. The IDOE's vision is to expand opportunities to include a broader range of assessment practices to support student growth. These trainings and future professional development opportunities are designed to help broaden educators' understanding of formative assessment and their use of different formative assessment strategies in the classroom. Let's focus on formative assessment by first taking a moment to look at this definition. Notice, formative assessment is a planned process. Thoughtful planning is key to successfully implementing any assessment strategy. On occasion, formative strategies may be implemented, yet the data is not collected or used effectively to guide instruction. Time to review, reflect, and draw conclusions from data helps teachers efficiently plan next steps for instruction. Formative assessment is also a continuous process, which we will talk more about as we move through this presentation. Later in the presentation, you'll also hear firsthand from teachers different ways to manage it as a continuous process. As mentioned previously, summative assessment is assessment of learning, whereas formative assessment is assessment for learning. Formative assessment requires preparation and uses multiple sources to determine how students are progressing. Evidence from these sources help teachers adjust instruction to best meet the needs of students at that moment in time and to enhance achievement. Formative assessment is classroom-based, supports learning during learning, and it provides real-time evidence by teachers and students to move learning forward. Formative assessment is not an event, focused on a single piece of information, a bank of test items, and it is not graded. Let's take a look at the formative assessment spectrum. In the previous visual, we noticed benchmark interim overlapped with summative. Benchmark interim would be categorized according to how data from the assessment is used. You'll also see several other formative assessment strategies listed along this spectrum. These are practices we would like to invite you to start using on a more regular basis within your schools and classrooms if you're not already doing so. So why is it we are asking you to incorporate these practices? Let's take a look at the benefits of using formative assessment. A particularly important finding is that while formative assessment raises achievement overall, it also helps low achievers more than other students. The National Council of Teachers of English, or NCTE, finds that students in classrooms that incorporate high-quality formative assessment practices are more likely to transfer learning from one class to another because they understand the given area thoroughly and can relate new learning to what they already know. Formative assessment practices also help students develop interpersonal and intrapersonal skills needed for life and work in the 21st century. This occurs because formative assessment requires planned, purposeful interactions as students make meaning, articulate thinking, and problem solve with peers and the teacher. Bloom finds that student achievement, motivation, and time on task were significantly higher in classes utilizing the formative assessment process. And CTE states that formative assessment fosters motivation because students have increased feelings of confidence and control. Formative assessment fosters self-regulation because students continually reflect on their learning, plan next steps, and serve as resources to one another in a collaborative learning environment. The formative assessment process encourages a growth mindset. It begins when teachers and students clearly identify learning goals and how student progress toward the learning goals will be measured. The formative assessment process is based on the notion that students bring varying knowledge and skills to the classroom and supports meeting students where they are. Some students may reach the learning goals through the planned opportunities in the classroom. Some students may need additional support. Some students may already have mastered the goals before instruction begins, and so they need learning to be deepened or extended. Thus, formative assessment assumes all students will make progress and uses evidence to provide appropriate opportunities for all students to recognize, develop, and use their abilities. Now let's take a look at the formative assessment process. Take a moment to look at the process. You'll notice it starts in the middle of this slide. First, learning goals are determined and criteria for success defined. Using various strategies, evidence of learning is elicited within the classroom, at which point data can be evaluated and any gaps in learning identified. Instructional adjustments are made to scaffold new learning to move all students to the next level. So let's take this visual and put it into words. The first question we ask is, where are we going, and what are the criteria that show we've arrived? Then we elicit evidence of learning. Evidence collected should be tightly aligned to the learning goals defined by the success criteria. Strategies should probe students' thinking to identify understandings, reveal misunderstandings, and uncover misconceptions. Multiple sources of evidence help draw accurate conclusions about student learning. There's no single way to collect information about student learning. Experts suggest that teachers and students consider students' needs, interests, and learning styles when deciding how to elicit evidence so that students have a choice of ways to demonstrate the success criteria. Peer and self-assessment of strategies, as well as thoughtful reflection, are critical aspects of this step. Then we interpret the evidence and ask the question, where are we now? The answer to this question may not come from a single event, but it is interpreted in the formative assessment process on an ongoing basis throughout instruction. Next, a plan is developed to adjust instruction to match students' learning needs. In other words, teachers select learning experiences that will give students appropriate opportunities to close the gap between where they are and where they need to go. Strategies and opportunities must be differentiated. Additional support and/or a more incremental approach to learning is sometimes referred to as scaffolding. Continuing with the same instructional and learning strategies if they're working, or extending the learning when they have already met the learning goals and success criteria. Finally, by eliciting, interpreting, and responding to the evidence, teachers and students maximize opportunities for students to successfully achieve the learning outcomes and close the gap. As one gap closes, teachers and students create new learning goals, renewing the formative assessment process. So what are the key characteristics of effective formative assessment? Identify and communicate clear learning goals and success criteria. Ensure students understand where they are going. Plan for and elicit evidence of learning during instruction. Interpret the evidence to identify where students are in relation to the learning goals and success criteria. Use feedback to make adjustments to instructional strategies and learning approaches to move students' learning forward. Involve students throughout the formative assessment process. In particular, support students to engage in peer and self-assessment and self-reflection to develop metacognition and self-regulation. Foster a collaborative classroom culture where students and teachers are partners in learning. So let's take a look at formative assessment in action. And what we'd like to do is look at 3 different teachers' use of formative assessment in their classrooms. And as you watch, we want you to look for how data is collected, how data is analyzed, and how data is used to adjust instructional practices. Our first video is from Pleasant View Elementary School, grade 2.
Hi, I'm Jody Burns, and I teach 2nd grade at Pleasant View Elementary School in Zionsville. The formative assessment strategy that I'm using is a combination of Post-it notes and student conferences. And so I use those to help the students learn to discuss books in an open format. And I allow the kids then to kind of lead the conversation. And we've talked at the beginning of the year, we started talking about predictions, and then we went into connections and character traits, and when they have questions, whether it's about vocabulary or about something that happened in the story, we lead them to the Post-it notes. And the fun thing that we've done this year is we had the students come up with the symbols to designate what type of Post-it note it may be. So if it's a connection, they use like this with their hands. So when we're reading on the floor, they can make the connections and we know what they're doing. As well as when they're in the Post-it notes, they have that circle for the connections. And then when they do predictions, they came up with an arrow. And then when they did questions, it's a question marks, and character changes, they have all different symbols so that when we meet in small groups and conferences, I can have them turn to that Post-it note and automatically know what we're going to chat about, and it can lead to deeper conversations. And you're going to share the Post-it notes that you had yesterday. We talked about connections, we talked about predictions, we talked about character change, and you talked about any questions or author's intent. Correct?
Yeah.
So you're going to share those in your group today. And at the end of meeting with your group, I want you to choose one of each of those Post-it notes from your group. So you'll have a total of 4 or 5 Post-it notes. And you're going to come and put them up here when you're done so we can see what your group thought about the text yesterday. What connections, what was the best connection that you made yesterday? How did you dive deep into it? What predictions do you have that this story, how is it going to end? How did the character change, whether it's Evan or Jesse? What are we noticing? And then do you have any questions? Or was there a part of the story that had some author's intent that made you laugh out loud? Or made you go, what? Right? Okay. And so I use those Post-it notes to help guide instructions, whether it's individual instruction, if it's whole group instruction, if the whole class is not getting predictions and they're just being kind of vague with them and not using text evidence, I can make a lesson on that right away, knowing that they didn't understand that. But most of the time I use the Post-it notes for strategy groups. If I see that kids are reading it, because it won't matter what book they're reading, but if they're not able to make predictions or connections using evidence, or they're struggling to dive deep, I can put those kids in a group together, and then I lead them in a conference that way. And you guys read this yesterday, and I heard you laughing and giggling, right? So, what was so funny about yesterday? Let's talk one at a time.
I thought it was really when he put the fruit flies all over. Yeah, that was my
Why do you think, I'm going to start with Catherine. So, Catherine, I like how you're using your Post-it note, and you had the author's intent signal there, so you knew that was where he had it. What did you put down?
I said it was hilarious when Jesse put flies to Evan's lemonade.
Why was that so funny?
Because before she was so calm and stuff, but then she started to get really uncalm and really competitive.
So did you notice a change in her character?
Yeah.
Was it unexpected?
Yes.
Okay, why, Cooper? Why was it unexpected?
Mine was Jessie.
Well, I want to take off of that, though, because you said yes, it was. What was her character trait at the beginning of the story?
At the beginning, she was like calm because it didn't really matter about her winning wars or like competitions, but now she really has to win. She was also like smart because she didn't do that stuff.
Do what stuff?
She didn't
try to do revenge on Evan for everything.
How do I collect the data? I collect data using a chart, a conference record. It's very informal. I sit with the kids, and as they're making comments, I just write little notes to myself. And then after I've met with them at the end of the day, I'll collect that information and guide it in my instruction. How do we think the story is going to end? What prediction do you think what is your prediction of how the story will end? I'm going to give everyone a chance. Quinn, let's start with you. How do you think this is going to?
I think that at the end, Jessie can't find her money, and Evan will claim he doesn't know what happened to it. So then Jessie's gonna try to call off the war or something.
Okay. And
Evan might try to deny it because he tried to not want to because he doesn't want to lose to his little sister.
Okay, so you think they're both going to try to call it off, but why do you think they're both going to try to call it off?
Well, Jessie will, but Evan won't.
Okay. Based on their character traits or evidence in your text, what gives you that reason?
Because Evan stole Jessie's lockbox, so so that's why Jessie will not know where it is. So she'll want to be like, no, but it's still not fair. I don't know where my money went and all that. And then Evan will try to not call it off because he doesn't want to lose to his little sister skipping a grade or something.
And he doesn't want to be embarrassed, does he? Okay.
Notice in this video, student involvement is high. Data is collected using an informal chart and as a conference record in a notebook. Data is analyzed to determine groups of individual or whole group instruction. The data collected is used to make instructional decisions. Our next video is from Pleasant View Elementary School, grade 3.
I'm Sarah Keel from Pleasant View Elementary, and I teach 3rd grade, and we were doing a math unit today. Based on yesterday, they did elapsed time, so at the end of their lesson, they turned in an exit slip, and I saw who got it and who didn't, and then the group I met with today were just the friends that need a little bit of extra help. So when we met today, we went back and reviewed yesterday's problem that they missed on the exit slip, and then I presented a new problem. When they did the new problem, it was guided, and then they had one to try on their own once they went to their seat work. So tomorrow there's only 2 in the group instead of all 6. I basically look at the end of the unit test and see the standards, and then I put it on a clipboard and match every standard with the problem that's in the unit. And then when I meet with them at the carpet, we do an intro and an exit ticket, so then I can easily collect to see who needs to be in my group that day. What would you say elapsed time is, Abby?
How much time it takes to do something or how much time they did it.
The amount of time that passed. So we've been working on really different strategies for elapsed time. So when you've been doing your independent work, we've noticed that we're really strong with some strategies, but we just need to keep practicing our strategies. So I want you to solve this first one using the timeline. Katie, what does the timeline mean?
The timeline means that you do bumps for the minutes and stuff to find out how many minutes to count up how many minutes to in the time passed.
I like how she said time passed, because elapsed time is the amount of time that passes. Can I see your whiteboard? Can I see your whiteboard? Can I see your whiteboard? 6:45. Look at what time you started at.
What do you always want is a minute? But what is it? Oh, 6:45.
I see a few different answers. As a teacher, you can't just move on to the next skill because they still didn't master it.
You'll notice data was collected by check sheet and exit slip. It was analyzed to determine who understood and who didn't. The data was then used to group those who needed more help. They then reviewed the previous problem, were presented a new problem using guided instruction, and the teacher checked for understanding. Students then engaged in guided practice, and again, the initial group went from 6 students down to 2. Formative data allows the teacher to continue to address areas of need for specific students, even when the rest of the class has moved on to new topics. Formative assessment is often messy. It has to work in real life. Let's take a look at the checklist that Sarah used. She mentioned using the end of unit test to write each standard on the clipboard and match every standard with a problem in the unit. Again, she then used intro and exit tickets to determine groups for that day. Notice she mentioned you can't move on to the next skill because some of them still haven't mastered it. Resources such as this checklist will be posted for download on the Formative Assessment Professional Development website. Our next video is from Zionsville Middle School, grade 7.
Hello, I'm Blair Williams, and I teach 7th grade science at Zionsville Middle School. Today in class, I used a Microsoft 365 form, which is very similar to a Google form. It's a free service, and all of our students have accounts through our school district. And I set that up today. You can set it up several different ways. I set it up with some multiple choice questions that covers the main idea of what we're studying within our geology unit. And I included some images for them to assess and be able to give me some information about what they've learned. Which letters are intrusions? Which letters are intrusions? Brett?
B and E.
B and E, very good. There's something a little unique about this situation. A little bit more complicated. Andrew?
E got split up by fault.
Very good. So E is an intrusion, but the intrusion then got split up by the fault. So let's think about our relative aging. What had to happen first? Amy?
The intrusion happened before the fault.
Right. In order for the fault to go through it, the intrusion had to happen first. Got it? Awesome. Okay, go to the Canvas calendar. There's a link for a 365 form. Answer a couple quick questions. All right, so let's take a look up here at our responses. Okay, first question. Awesome, guys. 100%. True age of a rock. Our graph shows us 100% got absolute. Same with relative age. So we've got that vocabulary word down. Next question. In horizontal rock layers, the layer on the bottom is always the oldest. That's pretty good. All right. What layer is the youngest? And so this is the one with the picture. So let's take a look at the picture here. We did really well. Here's our picture. The youngest is going to be on the top. So that should be D. All right. Almost everybody got that one. And the next question says, what layer formed right after the fault? So let's look at our circle graph on that one. Pretty good, only one. So let's just take a look at that really quick. What layer formed after the fault? So here's our fault. Remember, it has to go through everything that's already there. And then we've got the layer Q that comes on top. Yes? I've used these forms in a couple different ways. One way is similar to an exit ticket. And so as they're leaving the classroom, they'll complete a form. And then that way, after school that evening, I can go back and see if they understood the material from that class period. I've also used them like I did today, just to make sure they get it before we move on to the actual activity. And so with a 365 form, it pulls up an awesome circle graph, and it just gives me a percentage of students that chose a correct answer or an answer. And so I can very quickly see with each question how many of my students in a class period understand that question and that material. The other really cool thing is that I can click in that circle graph, and since the students are linked with their account, it will pull up their individual name, and I can see their response by their name. So a lot of times I'll go back and do that after class As you saw today in my lesson, I put the circle graphs up on the board, and so they were able to see how they were doing as a class as well. And the class you saw today scored pretty well, but some of my classes earlier in the day are very different demographic and struggled a little bit more, so some of the circle graphs didn't look as nice. So we took some time and we went back and looked at those questions and looked at some more examples, and we were able to kind of pinpoint what areas we needed to review. So it's really great for a whole class, and then I can also zoom in individually and then pull those students individually during work time, because after the formative assessment we had some independent work time, and so I could pull those students and work with them individually. One other thing that I have noticed, and our school has moved to standards-based reporting, and so many of our formative assessments used to count, we would count that into our grade, and now it's not, we don't count it towards our grades at all. And I just see that the kids are less stressed out. They are free to make more, they know mistakes are okay to make in class, and they're learning from those mistakes. So I feel that the students are much more comfortable in my class because they know we're going to practice several times before they're formally assessed.
Data is collected using a Microsoft 365 form, which is free. Blair uses this form a few different ways, as an exit ticket or to confirm mastery before moving to the next activity. Data is analyzed using the 365 circle graphs, which allow the teacher to drill down and see student names and determine who understood and who didn't. Results determine if they are moving on or need to reinforce either in whole class or individually during work time. Blair mentions the relationship between formative and summative assessment. Formative assessment targets student needs throughout a study so that when the time arrives for summative assessment, the student can be prepared and confident in his or her knowledge and skills. She also mentioned they moved to standards-based instruction and formative not being graded. She noticed students were less stressed. They realized making mistakes in class was okay, and students were reassured they'll practice several times before being formally assessed. Our next video is the principal of Pleasant View Elementary. He has been principal for 10 years. Listen for how he explains his role and how it has changed as the school adopted formative practices which have resulted in student growth.
Hi, I'm Chad Smith, principal at Pleasant View Elementary in Zionsville. I've been here as principal for 10 years. When I look back over the last 10 years and sort of where we're at today and where we started, in year one we were a school that held student compliance as a high value. There was a lot of whole group instruction in the building, and the school was actually really good. Students would do the work and we'd go about our day. And we didn't see a lot of engagement. We also didn't see a lot of really our growth targets being hit. Students were compliant and they were proficient, but not growing as much as what we had hoped for. So with any great change, we just started with conversations. And with those conversations also I needed to model as a principal empowerment. So it started with empowerment of my staff that then led to empowerment of students and student agency and student voice. But with the empowerment of my staff, it was really creating those conversations about what is it, and we started to look at formative assessment as the it to create change. So with formative assessment, how does that look? And we then empowered our teachers to have those conversations. We brought in the research, and we started to identify the gaps of where we currently were at and then where we wanted to be. And that really created the true growth for us. And with any good formative assessment, it's sort of like sports and coaching. We give feedback all the time. And that feedback can simply be you need to raise your arm or drop your step closer to the basket or whatever it might be that a coach might say. So it's in the process, it's in the real time that we're offering that feedback. Also, it's a system for the teacher that works for the teacher. So it should look messy. It shouldn't look like a professional published book or magazine. It's something that works. It's sticky notes. It's giving feedback along the way. And when we started to do that and really empower our teachers, our building changed from having meetings led by me to meetings that were occurring all over our campus that I really didn't know why. Teachers were meeting with teachers, they were collaborating, they were sharing together, and then they were offering that agency back to the students and offering choice in clubs, choice in some instructional design, choice in some assessment. So moving our school, I think, from good to great really started with just modeling as a leader, giving it back as far as full autonomy to our educators, allowing them along that process to have time and support, and then turning it over to them to see what great work they could create.
In conclusion, we want to invite you to incorporate formative assessment practices. Throughout this presentation, you've heard about assessments, the benefits of formative assessment, the process, keys to effective formative assessment, and we've seen it in practice. We've reviewed several examples and want to thank Zionsville Community Schools for letting us spend time with them to see it in action. As mentioned previously, we would like to invite you to incorporate formative assessment into your schools and classrooms. Please take the opportunity to use the references provided on the next couple slides to learn more about formative assessment and plan to incorporate it into your practice. We want to assist you in having a balanced system of assessments that work together to provide you the evidence needed to make sound instructional decisions for students. It is important to note that in the next webinar, a rubric which helps teachers to measure the effectiveness of formative assessment strategies will be provided and discussed. Please make note of the dates for the next training session presented on this slide. Also, if you have questions about formative assessment, please feel free to contact Mary Williams at the Indiana Department of Education. Here's the list of articles and documents used to support the content of this webinar for further reference. We'd like to thank you for joining us, and we look forward to working with you again in the fall. Thank you.